Hello and welcome to the session on rejection of matter. George Berkeley develops his immaterialist view in direct opposition to materialists. We must, however, explain what Berkeley means by this. Materialism here means any view affirming the existence of material things. Material things on this account are mind-independent things, which exist without being perceived. Berkeley's position is one in which all things are held to be mind-dependent. Indeed, the famous dictum, esse is percipi, to be is to be perceived, is an accurate representation of the view that Berkeley expounds. In this lesson, we will examine several arguments that Berkeley levels against the existence of a mind-independent world and two of the most obvious replies to his idealism. Material objects as represented. All ideas have their origin in perceptions, yet this does not entail that the perceptions themselves are causally related to an external material world. By sight, we have the ideas of light and colors with their several degrees and variations. By touch, we perceive, for example, hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and of all these more and less either as to quantity or degree. Berkeley rejects the casual picture in favor of speaking with the vulgar. He proposes that what is immediately perceived is all there is. Accordingly, no matter is needed to explain the existence of ideas in the mind. A more sophisticated version of materialism, however, accounts for the difference between immediate ideas of the mind and the immediate perceived qualities of matter. On this view, ideas resemble their object and are thought to be but copies of mind-independent qualities. This distinction nevertheless fails to evade Berkeley's immaterialism, as all that is perceived by the mind are the ideas, the notion that an idea can be like nothing, but an idea has devastating consequence to the materialist argument. Material objects as explanation. Materialism might still be maintained since it retains its explanatory value, where if not from material objects do our ideas originate. Common sense seems to dictate that the table and the pen correspond to actually existing physical objects, causing our ideas of them. Berkeley supposes that materialists themselves must doubt their own view, since sense affections are often found to be misleading. The materialist must thus admit to the fact that there do not have to be material objects corresponding to ideas. Furthermore, Berkeley can invoke a problem set up by dualism. Now that we have seen that the arguments Berkeley brings forward against the materialist hold, we must consider what charges the materialist may level against Berkeley and whether or not he can offer responses. Real and imaginary things. Firstly, the materialist will object that to make all objects mind dependent commits us to saying that there is no difference between real and imaginary objects. Both are after all ideas within a mind and have no substantial being beyond it. Real things are discernible from imaginary ones by them not being voluntary. They are not the product of the will. This first distinction excludes all deliberate falsification of this distinction. However, it does not suffice, for it allows for hallucinations and dreams to remain real. The second criterion Berkeley introduces is designed to counter such a fallacy. Real things are real only insofar as they exhibit a steadiness, order and coherence. The real world is then constituted by its regularity and correspondence to a set of patterns. The existence of unperceived objects. Let us for a moment assume all the consequences of this. If we leave the room, the things in it cease to exist as they are not perceived. However, as we re-enter the things in the room, will come back into existence. Berkeley himself seems confident that this objection does not pose too great a danger. Berkeley thinks that the things in my room will always be perceived when the right circumstances pertain. This argument depends, however, on one's conception of God. For Berkeley's God, as another external mind, guarantees the steadiness of patterns, the right circumstances, so that any time I would re-enter the room, I would find whatever things were there before. God as omnipresent being then offers stability and compliance to common sense to Berkeley's theory. Nonetheless, Berkeley is hard-pressed to offer an alternative for those who ascribe God a different ontological status. Example, non-existence. Certainly, Berkeley has the option of dismissing the argument concerning the existence of the table whenever it is unperceived, for it would be in line with speaking with the vulgar. What does it matter after all if things cease to exist when unperceived, as long as they return into being as soon as they are perceived? Berkeley's denial of material substance. Preliminary clarification. Before considering Berkeley's arguments, it will be wise to ask what is commonly understood by material substance and in what sense Berkeley denied its existence. For he always maintains that he is denying only the theories of certain scientists or philosophers, example, the Newtonians, Descartes and Locke. He asserts that his own view admits the existence of all that plain men understand by bodies or material things. It will also be wise to clear up beforehand the notions of perception and sensation. What do we understand by a material thing? It is always dangerous for philosophers to dogmatize about the opinions of plain men. What one ascribes to them is in fact an inference drawn partly from one's introspection of oneself in one's plainer moments and partly from the phraseology of everyday speech in the few languages with which one is familiar. There is always a risk of putting into the mouths of babes and of sucklings what could have occurred only to the wise and prudent. But provided that one is alive to the risk that one is taking, there is no great harm in taking them. It seems that a plain man means by a solid body or a bit of matter something which has all the following characteristics. First one, it is literally extended. It is bounded by a closed surface and has an outside and a front. Second one, it is literally pervaded throughout its volume and over its surface with certain extensible qualities, for example, colors, temperature, roughness or smoothness and so on. Third one, it is a center from which there emanate certain sensible atmospheres which form a kind of aura about it. Example, a characteristic field of sound in the case of a tolling bell or a waterfall, a characteristic field of odor in the case of an apple, a field of sensible warmth in the case of a radiator and so on. Fourth one, some of the qualities mentioned above are revealed by some of our senses and others by others. But the very same part of the same body, example, the upper face of a certain coin, has at the same time qualities proper to various senses, example, color, temperature and textual qualities. It has temperature and texture when one is looking at it and not touching it, and therefore is sensibly aware only of its color. And it has color when one is touching it and not looking at it, and therefore is sensibly aware only of its temperature and its texture. Moreover, it has temperature when one is only looking at it and in precisely the same sense in which it has temperature when one is feeling it. And one is only touching it has color in precisely the same sense in which it has color when one is looking at it. Lastly, it may have extensible qualities which none of our senses are fitted to reveal to us. Next point, besides having extensible qualities which it may present to us sensibly, a bit of matter has certain casual or dispositional properties, active or passive. Among these may be mentioned inertial mass, impenetrability, greater or less elasticity and so on. Next one, the same person can perceive the same part or different parts of the same bit of matter on various occasions by means of the same sense or different senses. And another point related with this, different person can perceive the same part or different parts of the same bit of matter by means of the same sense or different senses on the same occasion. A bit of matter can exist and change or remain unaltered and act upon or be acted upon by other bits of matter at times when no one is perceiving it. None of its extensible qualities or its powers is altered or abolished or reinstated by its becoming or ceasing to be perceived. All or any of the above common sense beliefs are true, but unless there be particulars which answer to all these 8 conditions, then there are no bodies or material things in the plain straightforward sense of these phrases. It is worthwhile to notice that philosophers who have explicitly or implicitly denied that there are material things have done so for one or another of 2 fundamentally different reasons. One of these is much more radical than the other. The more radical line is to argue that the notion of one or more of the characteristic which enter into the notion of material thing involves a contradiction, and therefore that nothing could possibly have that characteristic. This is line taken by Leibniz and by McTaggart. They argue that nothing could possibly be extended because to be extended would entail consequences. According to Berkeley, there are particulars which are extended, particulars which are colored, particulars which have sensible hotness, and so on. But in the first place, no particular which had color could possibly have temperature, none which had temperature could possibly have color, and so on. And secondly, every such particular is confined in its existence to some one particular occasion in the mental history of some one particular person. He calls such particulars ideas. Then again, according to him, there are also particulars which are persistent, capable of acting and being acted upon, and which exist independently of being perceived. But these are all unextended, and it is meaningless to ascribe to them color, temperature, motion, or rest, etc., or to suppose that they could be perceived by means of any conceivable sense. They are in fact minds or spirits. Their activity consists in volition, and their passivity in being caused to have sensations or images by telepathic or immanent action. Module 3, Sensation and Perception. Berkeley unfortunately uses the one word perceive to cover two quite different though closely interconnected kinds of experience. One is the non-inferential cognition which we take ourselves to have of material things and of certain physical events by means of sensation. This is the kind of experience which one would naturally express by saying, I see a cow over there, I am touching a bit of ice, I see a flash of lightning, I hear a bell tolling, and so on. The other kind of experience is having a sensation or quasi-sensation. When Berkeley is being careful, he no doubt intends to mark this distinction by the use of the phrases perceive and immediately perceive respectively. When he uses perceive in the wide sense, it includes, besides what he calls immediate perception, a great deal of what he would call suggestion. He takes the latter to consist of images evoked through association by an immediate perception. But generally he uses perceive for what he should describe as immediately perceive. This is a dangerous practice, and it is well to avoid it altogether. Even if we confine ourselves to using perceive in the way just mentioned, there is still a tiresome ambiguity about it, which we must now notice. Perceive, when so used, is a general name for seeing, hearing, touching, etc. Now it is customary to use such words as see, hear, touch, etc. only with the implication that the following two conditions are fulfilled: that the experience is veridical at any rate in its main outlines, that is, there is in fact a certain one body or physical event answering pretty clearly to the description which the experience would naturally give of the object which he claims to be perceiving at the time. That the experience is normally evoked. In the case of visual perception, this means that it is evoked by light coming to the experience's eyes directly or indirectly from a region outside his body. In the case of auditory perception, it means that it is evoked by a sound waves coming to the experience's ears directly or indirectly from an external source, and similarly mutatis mutandis for other cases. If we believe that either of these conditions is unfulfilled, we should not commonly say that a person is seeing or hearing or in general perceiving. Suppose example that I knew or believed that a person who claimed to be seeing an oasis in the desert or to be hearing a voice was dreaming or hallucinated. Then it would be contrary to usage for me to say he is seeing an oasis or he is hearing a voice. I might say he seems to himself to be seeing an oasis or he seems to himself to be hearing a voice. Or if I were making my statement in writing, I might put the word see or hear in inverted commas. Suppose again that I knew or believed that a person's visual or auditory experience corresponded to a certain distance seen, or even so closely as to exclude all question of chance coincidence. And suppose that I knew that the experience could not possibly have been evoked in him directly or indirectly by light waves or sound waves coming to his body from the region of that distant scene or event. Then again it would be contrary to ordinary usage for me to say he saw such and such a scene, or he heard such and such a sound. I should say, he seemed to himself to see it, or he seemed to himself to hear it. And I should add, but really it must have been a case of telepathy or clairaudience. Here the experience is veridical but not normally evoked. It is evident that then we need a word which shall be purely descriptive and shall not carry with it any implications either of normal evocation. We want a word which will cover, example, normal waking sense perceptions, waking delusive and veridical hallucinations and dreams. It is to use the phrase ostensible perception and the corresponding phrases ostensible seeing, ostensible hearing, etc. for its various specific forms. With this terminology, to see is to have an ostensible visual perception which is both veridical in its main outlines and normally evoked, and similar remarks apply to the words to hear, to touch and so on. Now, whenever a person is having an ostensible perception, he is having a certain sensation or quasi-sensation. To illustrate these terms, let us suppose, example, that a person has an experience, whether veridical or delusive, normally or abnormally evoked, which would correctly be described as ostensibly seeing a cricket ball. An essential part of their experience would consist in having a color sensation or a color quasi-sensation of a certain characteristic kind. The precise character of this could vary within certain ill-defined limits according to circumstances. If it were a normal waking perception, example, the details of the sensation would vary according to the part of the ball facing the percipient, according to his distance from it, the state of his eyesight, the lighting and so on. But it would certainly be a sensation of a round looking, convex looking, brownish expanse. But although a color sensation or a color quasi-sensation of this kind is an essential factor in any experience which could properly be called ostensibly seeing a cricket ball, it is not the whole of it. By a cricket ball, we mean something which is solid and spherical, which has coldness and smoothness and hardness as well as brownness, which has parts which are not at the moment manifesting themselves to the observer's senses, and which has casual properties such as mass, impenetrability, hardness and elasticity. By ostensibly seeing a cricket ball, we do not mean just having a sensation of a round looking, convex looking, brownish expanse. We mean, first one, having such a sensation, and second one, being led by it without any explicit process of inference and without even any experience of associative transition to take oneself to be facing and answering to the description which just given. It would be logically possible to have such a sensation without being led by it to take for granted anything of the kind. It might be suggested that would be the case with a young baby looking at a cricket ball for the first time. If so, it would be incorrect to say that the baby was ostensibly seeing a cricket ball, and it might well be incorrect to make even the vaguer statement that it was ostensibly seeing a globular body. A young baby would or even could have a visual sensation precisely like that which a grown person would have in similar situation. It is possible, and it seems to me likely, that the character of the visual sensation itself is subtly modified by the association which it comes to evoke. Then again, it is quite possible, both logically and casually, for a grown person to have such a sensation and not be led by it to take himself to be facing a cricket ball or even a body of any such kind. He might know or have reason to believe that he was subject to an optical delusion or a hypnotic suggestion. But in his case, there would certainly be a strong incipient tendency to take himself to be facing a cricket ball, and unless he made and kept up a pretty deliberate effort, he would find himself slipping into that state of mind. Lastly, a grown person might be dreaming or hallucinated and be at the time quite unaware of the fact. In that case, he would ostensibly be seeing a cricket ball, but his ostensible perception would be wholly delusive. Okay, now let us summarize what we have discussed so far. Berkeley's idealist account offers us an interesting alternative to the standard materialist view. The mind dependency of objects resolves issues that materialist philosophers had struggled with greatly and shows the arbitrariness of inferring the material world. However, Berkeley's account cannot provide us with compliance to common sense, something he thought would distinguish his view from the materialist doctrine. Indeed, Whether one accepts his inference depends on what status one affords to unperceived objects, and as we have seen, it is here that Berkeley fails to provide answers that resolve the issues without resort to an external guarantee. Whether or not to accept the claim that there is no material world then depends on one's willingness to bite this bullet. Now you can try to answer the questions given here. First one, what is meant by George Berkeley's rejection of matter? How Berkeley develops his immaterialist view in direct opposition to materialist? What do you mean by real and imaginary things? What do you understand by a material thing? Give a specific overview of the idealistic philosophy of Berkeley. Enlist some important viewpoints of George Berkeley regarding rejection of matter. What is commonly understood by material substance and in what sense Berkeley denied its existence? Hope that you may go through the reference books for further understanding. British Philosophy at the Age of Enlightenment, written by George Berkeley and D. Berman, published in 2004 by Routledge in London. Another book which can help you is A Companion to Early Modern Philosophy, published by Oxford, written by George Berkeley and McCrannan, and it is published by Blackwell Publishers. Berkeley's Thought, another book by G.S. Pappas, published by Ithaca, could help you in this endeavor. Another book is George Berkeley, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, in Shan, J. Central Works of Philosophy. Second one, the 17th and 18th centuries, Chesham, Acumen, Mulholland, R.G. Berkeley's Ontology, published by Hackett in 1992, written by T. Stoneham. George Berkeley, The Arguments of the Philosophers, published by Routledge and Kagan Paul in London in 1977. Berkeley's World, An Examination of the Three Dialogues, published by Oxford University Press in 2002 and written by T. Stoneham. Next one, An Interpretation, Berkeley, An Interpretation, published by Clarendon Press in Oxford in 1989, written by K. P. Winkler. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic soon. Have a nice day.